Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the concept of Ubuntu once again. This time, we're going to be discussing it as it relates to building curriculum, the instruction of language, and assessments. I think this is going to be a pretty good reading, because as we've been able to see, the concept of Ubuntu is so African that to start in any other place outside of this concept is failure for African people. So before I begin, as usual, I want to shout out everybody else on KWAZ radio. Make sure you guys tune into the Harsh Reality podcast. They just did an interview with a black conservative, which I thought was really good. Make sure to check that out. Make sure to check out Only Say discussing the organization and the work going into this this organization. Make sure to tune into the Queen's Council. And of course, make sure you like, subscribe, and share the content from this channel, the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Let me just make sure. Okay, it seems like I'm being heard. Also remember, in the upper right corner, you can text that phone number, or you can use that email to send any questions, comments, or what have you about any recent episodes that you listen to. At the bottom of the screen, you can see all the social media that we're on. We're on a bbtumi.com and .tv. We haven't set it up yet. We have this idea for what we want to do specifically for that site, a black-owned, black-created African site. And then we have the other social media that we will still be doing some work on to promote the podcast. But make sure you check out bbtumi.com, bbtumi.tv. So today, thank you for being here. I guess you guys didn't pay for Mike Tyson washing Roy Jones Jr., so you're here with me instead. I appreciate you. We're going to go through this reading. It should be a good time. We should learn something more about ourselves and about the work that we need to do going forward. So once again, the title of this paper is the Ubuntu Paradigm in Curriculum Work, Language and Instruction, and Language of Instruction and Assessment. It's by Birgit Brock-Utne. This paper was from February 2016, so it's not too old of a paper. The abstract says, this article discusses the concept Ubuntu, an African worldview rooted in the communal character of African life. Some of the same thinking can, however, be found in various Eurasian and Latin American philosophies. The concept Ubuntu is also used in language planning. Here, the question of language of instruction is discussed through an Ubuntu paradigm. The article focuses on policies regarding language in education, both at the micro level, where trans-languaging and code switching are central, and at the macro level, where prestige planning is discussed. The assessment practices taking place in schools are also looked at through an Ubuntu lens. How far is it possible for developing countries to adhere to an education policy based on their own values when they have to participate in tests like trends in international mathematics and science study, TIMSS, and the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, for development? Yeah, that's one of the things you'll find with African countries as well as Caribbean countries. Like, I think it's changing more now, but there was a time when the education paradigm in those countries were centered around old British concepts, right? And so your country was kind of beholding to a lot of what the British kind of mandated. And I'm talking about even after independence. And so if you, again, let your people have to, especially in a case like education, right? Or as we saw last time in industry, right? If you have to be beholden to a foreign force dictating to you what to do and how to go about doing it, you're a slave. You're a slave. And so this is the thing that we have to understand about building curriculum. It's for us and it's by us, right? Don't let anyone else get involved. Don't let anyone else co-opt the curriculum and add what they want to add. You create a curriculum that's for your people, right? That's for your problems and for your ability to go forward and solve these problems. Otherwise, you will be made a slave. So when you send your children to the public school system, I get it. Sometimes, that's the only move you can make. But at home, you have the opportunity, and especially with the project that we're working on, if you join in and help, you have the opportunity to create the necessary work, the necessary learning for you and your children going forward. So, get on board. Let's stop making ourselves be slaves all the time. Every generation, two things we do every generation. Every generation, we are still slaves. And every generation, we are slaves to the fact that we have to start from zero, from scratch, every single time. It's time for us to realize that if we want our families, even if we look at it selfishly, we just want our families to be better in successive generations. We got to put in the work so that when the next generation comes along, they don't have to start where we had to start. And same is true for the generation behind them. They don't have to start where our children have to start. Every generation is supposed to start off better and better and better. And it really begins with this education, which is only second to the concept of war. I'm going to talk about war a little bit later too. So in this section of the paper, the African Ubuntu paradigm, the African Ubuntu paradigm. So the basic African worldview is fundamentally different from the European or Arabic one. However, much Christianity or Islam may have been proselytized in Africa. Opening up curriculum content to African culture as expressed through African languages, sciences, arts, crafts, and religious beliefs involves reconceptualizing content from an African perspective. So because we're here in the West, I think there's a tendency to Africanize Western concepts of education, whereas we should probably, as this suggests as well, go back and just take wholly African concepts, right, of education. The problem with that is that a lot of African concepts of, things like education have been corrupted by the West. To continue, in the African tradition, knowledge is experientially and socially based rather than propositionally derived. As Roger Avenstrup points out, there could hardly be a greater contrast between Descartes' contextless, mentalist individualism, incogito, ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and the African contextually pregnant, social constructivist relationalism of Ubuntu, Babantu. I am because you are. Yeah, again, this shows you the mindset of Europeans versus Africans. Traditionally, their mindset is all about the I. That's why Maslow resonates so well with them, right? It's all about the self and how well you do, how well you perform as the individual. Whereas the Africans traditionally looked at it as me and you are together in this, right? We do as well as both of us do. In an article on African philosophy I co-authored with Azaveli Watema, 2010, encourage researchers to study indigenous systems of thought and remnant artifacts of wisdom of the kind. For instance, the late Julius Nyerere in 1968 drew upon in articulating the concept of Ujamaa, the essence of African socialism, or Ubuntu. You know, the one problem with calling it African socialism is that, again, you are putting an African concept in close proximity with a European one, with a European philosophy. And that's problematic, right? We want to distance ourselves from it. In fact, communalism and socialism, when you get down to the ingredients of each, they're different, right? If you look at the final product, you might say, well, they look alike, but the ingredients are different. Like Ubuntu, Ujamaa also denotes sharing, togetherness, and a feeling of familyhood. Catherine Odoro of Uganda emphasizes the communal character of African life and expresses concern about the way Western schooling destroys the communal nature of African indigenous education. Odoro notes, the moment children go to school, they learn to talk about my chair, my homework, my position, and less about our or we. The risk of alienation get more profound the higher one climbs up the ladder in search for the elusive certificate. Nothing but a word right there. Again, that's why you have leadership that sells you out. The leadership is educated in these schools. This is why the talented 10th didn't work out. Again, not to sound like a broken record, not a bad concept. Just bad execution considering from whom these talented 10th were getting or receiving their education. Tim Murphy in 2009 notes that the African cultural worldview, known as Ubuntu, highlights the essential unity of humanity and emphasizes the principles of empathy, sharing, and cooperation in our efforts to resolve our common problems. The Kiswahili expression pole, or pole sana, does not translate easily into any Indo-European language. It means much more than sorry or very sorry. It is an expression of empathy, meaning something like, I feel for you. Your problems are my problems. Polinakazi means, I feel for you for all the work you have to do. As we're talking about Kiswahili here, I put it out there before and I'll put it out there again. You know, I've been looking for someone, preferably female, who's on the continent or thereabouts, who is fluent in English and Kiswahili. I spoke about Abibi Tume TV.com and TV.tv earlier. And that's really one of the things I want to do over there. I'll just share this with you guys today. Original content that's a Kiswahili, like a conversational Kiswahili podcast. Me and a co-host who speaks the language, and I'm learning from them, you know, how to have conversations in Kiswahili. And therefore you will get to learn along with me, right? But it's to find this speaker. I'm having problems finding the speaker because, again, if you're going to build a curriculum that's African-centered, don't you think you'll need a language component of that curriculum that's also African-centered? And what's the best language for someone outside of the continent, right, who might not be sure where they're going to land upon repatriating to the continent, right? What's the best language to learn? Kiswahili is a good bet. So if you who are listening, if you know of someone, you don't have to be the best of friends with them, you don't have to be family, whatever, but if you know of someone who you think would be ideal for this idea that I have for this podcast, this second kind of language podcast for the Bit of Medicine podcast that we will host exclusively on a BB2Me, let me know. Mogobe Ramos in 2003 sees Ubuntu as the basis of African philosophy. Boketsi Letseka, 2012, page 48, highlights the key elements of Ubuntu understood as Motho ke Motho ka Batho in Sotho languages and Umuntu in Gumontu Gabantu in Nguni languages. Letseka renders these expressions in English as a human being is a human being because of other human beings. Letseka sees Ubuntu as a moral theory. He argues that Ubuntu encapsulates moral norms and values such as altruism, kindness, generosity, compassion, benevolence, courtesy, and respect and concern for others. And so you guys listening, I mean, wouldn't you want that to be the foundational work of a school curriculum in terms of teaching your children? Like, wouldn't you want this to be, you know, the thing or the place where your kids start in their learning journey? For Letseka, people living in communities that embrace Ubuntu are marked by a commitment to treating others with a sense of Botho or Ubuntu, justice, and fairness. I don't know why I try to highlight stuff in here. Although writing from an African, or more specifically a South African perspective, Letseka stresses that Ubuntu ethic of caring and sharing can also be found in various Eurasian philosophies. He finds similarities between Ubuntu and the German concept Bildung, whose key advocate was the German philosopher Wilhelm von Humboldt. For Humboldt, Bildung requires interchange between individuals. Bildung starts with the individual. Bildung starts with the individual embedded in a world that is at the same time that of the differentiated other. Just nonsense. Right? In a paper presented at the conference of the Comparative and International Education Society, CIES, in Washington, D.C. in March 2015, Thomas Lushai introduced the concept of convivencia, peaceful coexistence, as a framework for re-centering education as a moral enterprise. In his paper, he discusses vivencia within the context of education and society in Colombia, paying special attention to the Colombian rural school model, Escuela Nueva, or New School. He discusses several facets of convivencia and finds a number of parallels with the ideas and ideals of Ubuntu. So again, right, what are these guys doing? Are they not studying your traditional African self and trying to align it with, whatever nonsense they're doing? Actually trying to align whatever nonsense they're doing closer to your traditional African self? But you are trying to distance yourself from being African? You ain't trying to learn who you were, but before the interruption by these, Eurasians? The Sector 2012 points out that the Manifesto of Values, Education, and Democracy of the South African Department of Education identifies 10 fundamental values in the South African Constitution that pertain to education. These are democracy, social justice and equity, equality, non-racism and non-sexism, Ubuntu, here defined as human dignity, and open society, accountability, the rule of law, respect, and reconciliation. The report states that Ubuntu denotes mutual understanding and the active appreciation of the value of human differences. The European encyclopedic tradition from the Scots via Diderot has underpinned curriculum development in Africa from colonial times. Before colonialism, education was an indispensable component of societies. The education given at that time was functional to the requirements of each given social unit. As Henning Melber argues, the communication of knowledge, in contrast to what is understood by formal education and training in a European, and in the meantime a universal, context, did not primarily serve the distribution of positions of power. The transmission of knowledge was a necessity of life, and for this very reason, not selective. Melber wants people to decide anew on their own systems of knowledge, content, and transmission in local units corresponding to their particular conditions of life and social and cultural structures. What I wish for is a universal redefinition of education by the people it claims to be for. What do you want? That's what these guys are talking about. What are you talking about? You're just going along with whatever the public school system dishes out. You're not questioning it, you're not looking into it, and you're not doing anything at home, which is where you have the power to do stuff at home that reinforces, this African child in their African tradition. You can't blame anyone else for that area that you're lacking in. They're going to educate based on their own interests. They don't want smart Negroes, so they're not going to assist you in being a smart Negro. They don't want Negroes with high self-esteem. That's why they had those terms back in the day, like uppity nigger and all that kind of stuff. They don't want you to be a smart Negro. You have to want that for yourself, and frankly, you have to build it. But if you're not going to build it, support those who are building it. In the chat room, I got Onitase from the Pro-Black Perspective. Make sure to check out his content, like and subscribe. He says, absolutely, Ubuntu is where it's at. Your BB Toomey program sounds lit. Thank you, brother. Yeah, that's the thing, these things sound good, except for when you need the assistance from someone else, right? If I could get that assistant, if I could get that person, I have it all figured out how it can be, worthwhile to the person as well. I just need to find that person. I've been looking up on a BB2Me for that person as well. I just haven't been on a BB2Me enough as of late to really flesh out, a good candidate for this idea. But thank you for the compliment on. Frederick Muya Nafuko in 2006 looks at the contribution of the Ubuntu paradigm to adult learning in the workplace. He claims that in traditional African society, adult learning was viewed as holistic learning for life and work and formed the foundation of many African societies. This is why I'm saying to you guys, the curriculum that we're building, yes, is for the children, but it's for you as well. This is why I always add in the adult with the children. You can still learn. Now, how dope would it be to learn with your children and see them acquire the knowledge that will take us into the next generation at a better footing than we are in this one? Learning took place in the African languages that people spoke and was used to break down barriers and to combat social exclusion. In Berlin in 1884, the European powers divided the continent of Africa into territories. Each territory was controlled by a particular European power and assigned a particular European language. African countries as colonies, and even today as so-called independent countries, came to be defined and to define themselves in terms of the languages of Europe. Anglophone, Francophone, or Lusophone, etc. These became the official languages of the state and of formal schooling. The first formal attempts at European schooling in Africa were made by Portuguese missionaries. The Portuguese, it seems, went further than any other colonial power in Africa in encouraging educated Africans to give up their mother language, their mother tongue, and to substitute it with Portuguese. So let me read this again. The Portuguese, it seems, went further than any other colonial power in Africa in encouraging, I hate that term right there, encouraging educated Africans to give up their mother tongue and to substitute it with Portuguese. When we write about what happened in Africa, including the transatlantic slave trade, including how the European powers divided up Africa. When we talk about that, there's a certain way we must talk about that. We mustn't make it seem at all like it was something pleasant, like it was a choice, like it was something good. We must talk about it in terms. Whenever we write about it or talk about it, we must write and talk about this thing in its proper context, right? Don't shy away from words like raping and forcing and, subjugating and oppressing. Don't walk away from those terms, right? You let these people off the hook when you write and speak in somewhat, glowing terms. There's nothing good about what they did in Africa. You Christian Negroes who like to talk about, well, if it wasn't for slavery, I wouldn't have never known no Jesus. You could have done without knowing Jesus too. Get out of here with that bullshit. There was a clear difference between the language policies pursued by the British and the French in their African colonies. Bob White in 1996 claims that the main distinguishing feature of French colonial education was the widespread use of the French language. He quotes Joseph Jules Brevet, Governor General of French West Africa, who in 1930 wrote that the native's mind can become disciplined by the mastering of spoken French, implying that learning the French language is an education in and of itself. Abdurrahim Syed Bakar, 1988, of the Comoro Islands, said of his school days, since we were considered as French, a part entière, nothing but French was taught. The whole curriculum was based on France and anything that was French, whereas Comoroan, our mother tongue, was never considered to be a suitable medium of instruction. Man, when you read about this stuff, or when you hear about this stuff, I mean, you really got to think about the balls on these folks. You really have to think about the balls on these folks, right? To push themselves on a people like that. But more importantly, you really got to think about the balls you need to have to push them up off of YouTube. You got to stop bull jiving with these folks, man. The British government was from the start much less involved than the French in the educational policy of its African colonies. Missionary education played a prominent role in the history of the British African colonies, and the missionaries saw the value of the use of vernacular languages. When the mission schools were taken over by the British government, however, they too introduced English at an earlier stage and relegated the vernacular languages to an inferior position. The Kenyan author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, writes that language supplemented the colonizers' swords. Gotta highlight this. Language supplemented the colonizers' swords and bullets as a means of subjugating Africa. But the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the chalkboard. Damn. The bullet was the means of the physical subjugation. The language was the means of the spiritual subjugation. And that's true. I mean, when someone forces you to speak their language, they have you. I mean, truly, they do have you by the soul at that point. You know? There's one thing for the bully to beat you down, but there's a total other thing for the bully not only to beat you down, but then to make you do and say and speak as he does. And this is why we got to really understand our position since we've, come to encounter these folks and where we are. Like, we're being sunned crazy out here. Well, we're being sunned crazy out here. I remember Peter Tosh would say, Peter Tosh, he was a part of the Whalers, and he had a stuttering problem. And he attributed his stuttering problem to the fact that the language he was speaking, which was English, wasn't his mother tongue. It's a foreign tongue. And he attributed this idea that the reason why you have a lot of speech impediments amongst black children, black folks, is because we speak a foreign tongue. And like I mentioned a few weeks ago, it's so bad now that for me to read something in, that's from an African language, that's now become like a foreign tongue to me, and I dare say to us. So we kind of stumble over our words, trying to say some of those words, right? We're in a bad place. But we can make it better. This spiritual subjugation is still going on all over Africa. By the way, while I'm here, guys, make sure to give me a thumbs up on the video. Last video I had a good number of concurrent listeners, 1 like. The likes and the subscriptions. So there's 3 things: likes, subscribes, and the number of minutes or hours that people listen is what really starts to get the channel to where we needed to be, right? Those three things, that trifecta, is what's near. Not just for me, I'm talking about the pro-black perspective, I'm talking about the Harsh Reality Podcast, Queen's Council. It's the likes, the subscribes, and it's the amount of minutes or hours people actually view the videos. That's what gets us where we want to be, right? That also means that you got to share it, because more people who see it, right, it's more watch time for us. The spiritual subjugation is still going on all over Africa today. The former colonial languages, spoken comfortably by only 5% of the population, are still the languages of instruction in all African schools, normally from grade 4 in primary school, but sometimes from as early as grade 1. That means they get your children real early, right? They've got your children, this thing won't do. They got your children real early. Except for the use of Afrikaans in some South African universities, there's not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa that uses an African language as the language of instruction at secondary and tertiary levels. That is a shame. I didn't realize it was. I did hear Umar Johnson talk about this a couple years ago, but he didn't put the emphasis where it needed to be. That is a shame. You've had independence for how long? But again, when you go and you study it, you study the powers that be in these countries, they grew up under the colonial education. Their elites, the elite families also grew up under this colonial education. So these sellouts now are still pushing this colonial education. If the people have you speaking their language from grade 1, right, as early as grade 1 or mostly from grade 4, they have you for a lifetime. Listen, I didn't start learning no foreign language until I was like in junior high school, back in the Caribbean. And I dare say most Caribbean islands are like that. That's when you in junior highs, when you get introduced to French or Spanish. These guys are getting you from primary school. Only to say the pro-black perspective says, damn, that was written in this paper was written in 2016. I would expect this last sentence I read here to be written like back in maybe, 1971 or something. This is 4 years ago. Almost 5. So this is the thing too, and this is the thing I would like to connect with people on the continent in various countries. Like who's the pro-black perspective? Who's only to say right now in the continent? Who's the Harsh Reality Podcast right now in various countries in the continent? And I dare so say, who's the Koku in the continent? Who's the person reading this stuff, right, or discussing these ideas and saying, damn, I can't believe we are still doing this? Or damn, can you believe this? And who's trying to organize, right, in these different countries in the continent, 50 plus, to say, nah, this is foolishness. This is nonsense. South African universities, there's not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa that uses an African language as the language of instruction at secondary or tertiary level. I tell you, the work, Africa awaits us. But Africa really needs, the African on the continent really needs to get their shit together too. And this is where I like to make those connections with people on the continent, not just doing some, you know, I hate to put it like that, but not doing like just talking about stuff. I want to talk to people who's really connected with, you know, the pipelines towards power in those countries. But every time I do a broadcast, there's a ambulance or fire truck or someone speed racing outside my window. It's crazy, right? But we gotta start tapping into this pipe. Those of us outside talking about Africa, we really have to start, you know, getting ourselves linked up with the continent better. Because this stuff is just madness. Even languages with millions of speakers like Kiswahili, 131 million speakers, and Hausa, 53 million speakers, are not used as languages of instruction at the higher levels of education. And in there lies another problem, right? If we're out here talking about building curriculum and making sure there's a language component and that Kiswahili or Hausa, I didn't mention Hausa earlier, but Kiswahili is a good option, right? How are you going to sell that as a good option when those languages are not even used to teach the African students on the continent, right? When it comes to secondary and tertiary education. I'm not saying that we must abandon the idea. Hell no. I think the same way that we were expected to learn Spanish or French or something in school, we should be pushing in our own education systems. We should be pushing for this African language. Like I said, Kiswahili probably number one, and I guess Hausa's number two, right? But how does the continent specifically, right, really reconcile the idea that we're outside of it, working to get back to the continent, right? And planning what we think is strategically to learn an African language like Kiswahili, right? But you guys don't even teach your own people in an African language, particularly Kiswahili or Hausa. We got work to do, man. The use of the former colonial languages in Africa has become a social marker and serves to keep a tiny minority at the top. The elite who can afford to send their children to expensive private schools, give them private tutoring, and buy them books, textbooks, and DVDs to see to it that their children survive in this system. Whilst the majority of children who do not speak the colonial languages either drop out of school or sit there year after year, learning nothing except self-contempt. Ouch. In order to change the situation, the languages children speak must be brought into the classroom. And there it is. Right? If you have to go to a school and the school, you don't do anything in your own native tongue while at school, you have nothing but contempt that's going to be brewing within you. And by the way, this idea I have about the Kiswahili podcasting, you know, I have on my Discord and in my belongings, I have, you know, Kiswahili PDF books. I think I have Hausa as well, that I'm willing to put up there for free. The problem is, and this is the thing that happened to Black folks, you know, Africans in America and stuff like that, is they learn the language. This is where Ebonics or what they call AAVE or whatever, this is where that comes from. You learn the language just by hearing it. You never learn the language by seeing the written word and then hearing the sound and then pronouncing the sound. That's how you really learn languages, right? I have the book, but if we don't have the sound, we don't have a person immersed in the language who can correct us on our pronunciations, our inflection, our emphasis, etc., then you'll just be reading words. And that's fine. If you could read in a language, that's fine too. But if you really want to be conversational and more immersed in the language and its culture, etc., or cultures, it'll be nicer to have someone who's fully there and who can guide you through the language. So again, if you guys know someone, you've encountered people, just pass them, send them my way, or alert me to who they are, and I will try to link up with them. In an article presenting an African perspective on peace education, Maruthi, 2009, notes that the Ubuntu approach to human relationship building offers an example to the world. He shows how Desmond Tutu drew on the principles of Ubuntu during his leadership of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. Witnesses at TRC hearings were granted the right to give testimony in their home language. Translators and transcribers worked in most of South Africa's 11 official languages. Maruthi further outlines the 5 stages of the peacemaking process found among Ubuntu societies: acknowledgement of guilt, showing remorse and repenting, asking for and giving forgiveness, and paying compensation or reparations as a prelude to reconciliation. That's interesting. If you guys know a better PDF reader, preferably a free one, that allows me to highlight better than Adobe, please let me know. So this was about Ubuntu with Desmond Tutu. Okay. So translanguaging and the Ubuntu paradigm. In an article on translanguaging in the multilingual classroom, Ophelia Garcia and Sarah Hessen, 2015, note that language and education policies in schools have traditionally insisted on the use of the standardized variety of the language or languages of instruction. As a result, many language minoritized students, speakers of different varieties of the languages used in schools, have high rates of academic failure. Educators are simply not doing enough to leverage the complex and dynamic languaging that students bring into the classroom. So you notice these people were named Garcia, right? So I could bet money they're talking about like these Puerto Ricans and stuff who speak a Spanish that's not really accepted in Spain. But this writer, I guess, is using this to make a point. Let's see what the point is. The translanguaging framework has mainly been applied to the study of language practices and the teaching and learning of bilingual, multilingual students in the United States. Garcia and Hessen give examples of innovative teachers who use a translanguaging framework at the micro level, that is, in their classroom. They discuss the case of the teacher Lucas, who encourages his multilingual students to use their entire language repertoire in the classroom on a daily basis. The following list is displayed on his classroom wall. Take notes during independent reading time in any language. Brainstorm and outline your ideas in any language. Annotate science and social studies texts in any language. Ask for help with unfamiliar vocabulary or difficult concepts in any language. Try your idea out loud in any language before speaking or writing it in the target language. Create a summary or version of your final work in an additional language to share with speakers of that language. Keep multilingual vocabulary lists. Research a new topic using all your languages. Now, I'll tell you something. I'll tell you that not a bad idea for folks learning a language. Like, one of the things I remember in college doing the language requirement, which for me was Spanish, there was this soap opera, and they had a companion book for the soap opera. I forgot the name of the soap opera now. Destinos? It might have been Destinos. And so while you were watching the soap opera, right, you were also like reading and talking about, you were totally immersed in this soap opera and learning the language. So you had the opportunity to express your ideas in English for yourself, and also transcribe those ideas into Spanish. So I get that as well in what they're trying to do here. Though Garcia and Hessen applaud the teachers who create multilingual spaces in their classrooms and are concerned about the right of every student to work in a familiar language, they claim that translanguaging cannot happen only from the bottom up. Organized language management policies must also encourage translanguaging from the top down. The South African sociolinguist Lakita Michaela in 2014 has found that the translanguaging framework can be very fruitfully applied to the multilingual situation of South Africa. Most Africans are multilingual in African languages. Moreover, multilingualism is increasing as more people move within and between countries. Kwesi Kwa-Pra in 2009 found that in Nima, Ghana, 69% of those interviewed spoke at least 4 languages, whilst 41% spoke 5 languages or more. In the introduction to an edited volume, Pra and I view Africans' multilingualism as an advantage and argue on the basis for a paradigm shift in languages of instruction policies in African schools. We know that an African who speaks 2 very different African languages is not called bilingual. It is only when one of the languages is an ex-colonial language that the African is called bilingual. More madness. Here we are, or let me speak for myself. Here I am, here in the States, looking at Africans as multilingual, right? Much less bilingual. And the Africans themselves don't see themselves as multilingual, unless one of the languages is some kind of francophone or what have you language. Come on. Africa has work to do. We also show that many of the language of instruction policies and concepts worked out to fit immigrants and minority populations in the affluent West do not fit the majority populations of developing countries. Concepts like submersion, immersion, mother tongue, first language, L1, second language, L2, etc., frequently do not fit the African situation. The Tanzanian school inspector describes how he grew up with 3 different languages. He would speak one language with his father's clan, another unrelated language with his mother's clan, even though they all lived in the same compound, and Kiswahili with his friends. I forgot who it was on Twitter. I think it was someone that Onyi Chase was speaking to, and I saw the exchange, and I asked the person, like, how related are these languages? Like, you know, they're like speaking like 4 or 5 different languages. And it turned out like these languages aren't really related. So that also tells you something about, not that we needed this to reassure us or anything, but that tells you something about the intelligence of our people. Languages aren't easy for everyone to learn, especially those out here in the West. But when you're in that situation of learning not just one tongue but different tongues, there's an intelligence that goes with that. And so also when you see folks in the States complaining about the Africans coming to America and getting ahead and they're given this and all this stuff, nah, understand. These folks are coming out of a tradition where they have to be quick learners, they have to be good learners, etc., to understand multi-languages. Sometimes they have to interchange between 4 and 5 languages at a time, depending on where they are. I remember growing up back home, and there was a young Haitian lady, and she was studying German. And I asked her about it. She said, yeah, well, they speak Creole. I learned French. I figured German, my next language is Latin. And when you look at the young lady, and this is many years ago now, when you look at this young lady, you wouldn't think she's on it like that. But coming from a country where she just knew Creole to then come to a country where, she was able to still speak Creole but had to learn English, like that mind, the mind of that person is a little bit different than someone who just grows up, who just comes up on one language. And you got to understand that as well. He cannot say which language was his mother's tongue or L1. Adama Owan, in 2009 from Mali, the former director of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, also grew up with 3 different African languages simultaneously. And like Kamizi, cannot say which one is his mother tongue or first language. Using a trans-languaging framework, which recognizes alternation of languages as a norm in contemporary societies, would, according to Makalela, help to orient multilingual and bilingual education towards the African value system of Ubuntu. It would also act as a catalyst for restoring social justice for the people whose languages were historically denigrated to the lowest social status. It offers insights on rethinking the South African multilingual space to accommodate fluid, discursive resources where interdependence is highly valued over independence of value systems. And with that idea I have about the podcast that I gave y'all earlier, the person doesn't have to be even fluent in English. They could just get by. They could learn English from me as I learn the language from them. You see what I'm saying? Reciprocity. Right? Makalela, 2015, sees translanguaging as closely connected to the Ubuntu ideology, especially in the case of South Africa, where the Black majority population speaks many African languages. He argues that African multilingualism should be interpreted according to the value system of Ubuntu. Makalela reports on a study carried out in a rural area of Polokwane in the north of South Africa, where all of the learners' linguistic resources were harnessed in order to teach them how to read and write. This approach resulted in significantly improved results both in learners' home languages and English. According to Makalela, the success of this approach in this context lends support to an Ubuntu languaging model which propagates multilingual literacy strategies that validate interdependence and fluid, versatile communicative resources. These resonate with the ancient value system of Ubuntu. In Ubuntu languaging, there is an embodiment of African multilingualism where one language is incomplete without the other. Makalela, in 2005, claims that the language policy of South Africa is not progressive, since the 9 African languages to which it grants official status are the same languages that the apartheid government used to divide the blacks into Bantustans or homelands. It would have been more progressive, he claims, to merge the writing forms of most of the black languages into a Sotho variety and a Nguni variety, I gotta look up with the Sotho and Nguni a little bit more. If you know more about these two concepts, put it in the comment section so we all could learn about it. Or if you have a link, put the link in the comment section so that we could all learn something a little bit more. The same argument is voiced by Neville Alexander in 1989. Both Alexander and Makalela claim that most of the Nguni languages, which is Xhosa, Zulu, Swati, Inbedel, and the so-called Sotho languages, Northern Sotho, Setswana, and Southern Sotho. Okay, so now we have a better understanding of what's going on here. Are just dialects of each other. So these languages are familiar. If you know one, in this case, it's not difficult to learn the others, it would seem. In a chapter on the standardization of South African dialects, Palandwa Mulodzi, 2002, notes that in 1961, the Prime Minister of South Africa's apartheid government, Hendrik F. Verwoerd, put a stop to the work of harmonizing the orthography of the Nguni and Sotho languages that had been going on since the early 1930s. Quote, the committees which were formed before 1961 for Sotho and Nguni languages were dissolved. From this date onwards, the emphasis was on promoting language as a central marker of ethnic identity. See, the thing is, when you unite languages, and if I'm not wrong, didn't Julius Nyerere do this? When you unite languages, right, you can unite nations. You're that much stronger when you unite the tongue. You're that much stronger. On the other hand, too, when you speak a foreign language, and that's your main language, right? When it comes to the strategy of war, you have already lost a huge advantage because you speak the tongue that these people you're warring against can understand. But when you speak your mother tongue, right, it's difficult. Right, that's when they have to get code breakers and all kind of stuff to kind of try to understand what you're talking about. It's more difficult, right? And so that's one of the advantages of speaking an African language for us, home and abroad. It allows us to be in spaces that makes it much more difficult for these folks, you know, to defeat you. The notion of language as a marker of ethnic identity was so vigorously promoted in apartheid South Africa that language was used as the primary criterion for assigning people to an ethnic group and a homeland. The apartheid government enacted legislation to relocate various groups of people to separate homelands on the basis of the... Now, why is the apartheid... Now, think of the word now. Why is the apartheid government doing that? It's division. The language, therefore, became the defining feature of state nationalism. It is clear why the apartheid government did not want to continue the harmonization process which had started between the different varieties or dialects of Nguni and Sotho languages. It did not want the black majority population of South Africa to unite. So when you start to take on the challenge of understanding, of reading to understand what's going on, you kind of get to kind of precog where a point is going. So like, for example, if you've watched television for 30 years, you've seen movies for 30 plus years of your life, right? It takes a real skilled writer to surprise you with where the direction of the plot of a story is going. And the reason is because you've seen the stories done and redone so much that you kind of have an idea what's coming. Again, it takes a good writer, a very good writer, to kind of surprise you and throw you off and, you know, throw something new in the mix. It's the same is true when you do these kind of, when you read about this concept, this African concept of Ubuntu, and you read how the Europeans are just pretty much opposite to that, right? They're more about individuals, right? And then you come to a part of the reading like this that talks about the apartheid government. You're supposed to already know what they're doing and why. The reality in the new South Africa, however, is that members of the Black population are becoming more and more familiar with one another's languages. People are not only code switching, which is switching from one language to another, which Black folks tend to be really good at, by the way, but also translanguaging, using several African languages in the same sentence, not only in informal conversations, but also in schools where children from different language backgrounds meet. All right, so when I was talking about translanguaging earlier, and I was talking about the fact that the person's name was Garcia, the point I was trying to get across was like, if you've ever been inside these inside a classroom or around any like so-called Spanish person or Latino person, right? You'll find out that the language that they speak, that we would call Spanish, in Spain, they look down on that shit. They're like, what are you talking about? Right? And it's because they're using different dialects and different wordings and stuff like that, that the main Spanish group wouldn't really gel with. And so what those teachers were trying to do, it seems to me, was set up an environment where the the so-called Spanish-speaking students could operate in their tongue, right? The way they speak, the words that they use, right? And then later on, after the thoughts are fleshed out, convert those thoughts to the mainland Spanish or what have you, right? So that's what they were talking about. That's what I was referring to when I brought them up earlier. Not only in informal conversation, but also in schools where children from different language backgrounds meet. How should a teacher react to this phenomenon? The fluid mixing of languages demonstrably makes sense to learners and helps them to learn. If the teacher has the same capacity to switch between a number of different indigenous languages and varieties, should she or he nevertheless insist that the language of the classroom is English, even if his or her own grasp of that language is flawed and the pupils non-existent? Teachers normally know best what works in their own classrooms. I'm reminded of an incident in a classroom in Litcha, a Black township near the airport in Cape Town, where we conducted an experiment as part of the Loitasa project. An experimental class was asked to study certain subjects in Xhosa in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Learning materials in Xhosa were provided. The other classes were control classes and were supposed to carry on in English as per the official policy of the school. One day when I walked into one of the control classes, I was surprised to find the teacher teaching mostly in Xhosa. I asked her afterwards, aren't you teaching a regular class and therefore required to teach in English? Yes, she answered. That is what I'm supposed to do. But if I do that, the children do not understand anything. It would be like teaching dead stones. I have heard the same from teachers in secondary schools in Tanzania, who code switch between Kiswahili and English all the time. Right? Makalela found through his research that learners who had been taught through a translanguaging model in which they were given assessment questions in several languages and allowed to answer in a language of their choice did better in all subjects, including English, than learners who had been taught in English only. And that's what I'm saying. It's a brain exercise of sorts, right? That if we get you at a young enough age doing these type of brain gymnastics of jumping between in and out of these different languages, this code switching, you are going to create a more intelligent being. And so when you, again, like I said earlier, when you see these folks coming to America and stuff like that and succeeding, there's reasons for it. It's not that Whitey is just giving them this and Whitey hates, you know, the Africans in America, and so they prop them up. No. There's an intelligence you're working with there. And you can't, and it really can't be denied. It's already known that children who speak more than one language tend to do better in school. That's just a known fact. So when you look at your population within this nation, and you ask yourself, well, do we speak other languages? Are we born into speaking 3, 4, 5 languages? The answer is no. That does something to your progress in the future. The translanguaging paradigm therefore seems well suited for classroom communication among the majority of the population in South Africa, especially where the teacher also masters several language varieties. But it's difficult to see how translanguaging can serve the Black population until the relevant languages are harmonized into a common written form, perhaps one Sotho and one Nguni variety. You know, that reminds me, wasn't there a brother, in fact, it came up in the WhatsApp group like a month ago, but wasn't there a brother who was combining a lot of African languages into one language? I forgot the name now, but there was one or two brothers whose life work was to combine all these languages into one language, right? I wonder what's going on with that. I haven't heard anything about it. There's already encouraging evidence that things are moving in this direction. In Soweto, for example, people speak a number of both Nguni and Sotho languages, and a language is developing which incorporates vocabulary from both language families. The national anthem of South Africa has words from both Sotho and Nguni languages. The Center for Advanced Study of African Society, KWAZ, is also engaged in very valuable harmonization work. CASAS is a Cape Town-based non-governmental organization which promotes African language all over the continent, apart from the Arab-speaking nations. KWAZ was established in 1997 to lay the foundation for the development and unified orthographies for cognate and proximate African languages, which had until then been written differently. KWAZ's scope and political profile is Pan-African. Bam. Right? Pan-African. And its scientific focus is linguistics. From small beginnings, the scope and depth of KWAZ's work has grown over the years to the point where KWAZ is now globally recognized as a leading player in the development of African languages for education and communication. This is stuff you gotta take note of. KWAZ's research shows that 90% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa can be grouped into 23 language clusters, i.e., groups of languages whose commonality is a mutual intelligibility can be established through linguistic analysis. And this is something I like to hear. I hope it's a completely African initiative, because this is the work that we need to do. We need to do the work for our people instead of having others do the work for us and just sitting back, right? We got to put in this work. 12 to 15 of these clusters would cover 75 to 85% of the population if used at the highest level of teaching in court in the press, and in parliamentary debates. The clusters are structurally and lexically cognate, i.e., they have much in common. Alexa, stop. This fact permits KWAZ to harmonize the rules of spelling within clusters. Nevertheless, each cluster does not constitute a single language, nor are all variants within a cluster exactly the same. If the languages within each cluster were written in the same way, their mutual intelligibility would also be reflected in writing. This is the goal that KWAZ linguists are working towards. KWAZ linguists are native speakers of the languages they work on. Most of the missionaries who first put African languages into writing were not native speakers of those languages and had difficulties distinguishing between dialects and languages. They used spelling based on their own languages, which often led to confusion and misinterpretation. Once you do anything behind these folks, expect confusion and misinterpretation. The linguistic work done by KWAZ, by contrast, is impressive. No one can learn in a language they do not master. In the chat room, the pro-black perspective says that Afro-Keely is one such language. Afro-Keely is one of these languages that someone was putting together, wording and phrasings of various languages across the continent, right? Together as one, Afro-Keely. You can look that up. It is clearly not possible to develop some 2,000 languages to serve the majority of Africans as languages of instruction at all levels of learning and as languages of adult education, the courts, the press, parliament, and government. But it is possible to develop 12 to 15 African languages to such a stage. The work of KWAZ is therefore critical for reaching the post-2015 goals, as well as for strengthening democracy and development in Africa. A recent article examines in some detail the work undertaken by KWAZ and its successive challenges. If you guys want me to, I can read that article on air, but it's only if you guys tell me you want to hear about it. I could find it. This article shows that the process of getting the harmonized languages adopted by the relevant political bodies is often slower, more difficult, and more unpredictable than the linguistic work itself. In the light of this, Koko Kamwangamala in 2015 suggests that there is a need for what he calls prestige planning, which brings us to the next part of the paper that's called prestige planning. Before I get into that, though, let me take a quick station ID. I'll be right back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. Make sure to follow those shows on KWAZ Radio. And make sure to stay tuned for other things coming down the pipe from KWAZ Radio as well. So, prestige planning. Kamwangamalu, 2015, suggests that language education planning in Africa is in need of a paradigm shift. Rather than critiquing inherited social policies, he proposes what he calls prestige planning for African languages in order to make them, like English, an instrument of upward social mobility. In contrast to the translanguaging approach being used separately, especially among the black learners in South Africa, and the code switching approach used in many other African countries, both of which are strategies on the micro level, prestige planning is a macro level strategy which requires political willingness to exchange the power relations in a country. Which requires political willingness to change the power relations in a country. It is a strategy that would that would enhance the development of the majority population of Africa and thereby that of the entire African continent. The call for prestige planning for African languages is made against the background of theoretical developments in language economics. The focus is on the reception, not the production, of language planning. Kamwangamalu argues that until African languages are associated with a market value, that's the thing, right? English will continue to dominate the educational systems of African Commonwealth countries, much as it did in the colonial era. So you see, that's a point that's made. I remember in college telling someone saying to me, like, they wanted their children to learn Chinese. And I was a black person. I'm like, Chinese for what? Well, because China is taking a bigger share in the world. And I get that. But you see, that's a part of the whole propaganda game as well. When you make it so that there's no functional use of an African language, then people won't learn that language or those languages, right? That's why we have to set up, and I'm sure Gavi would have come to this conclusion too, because Gavi was looking to run ships back and forth between the U.S. and Africa and in between, that we would have to have a tongue, a language that we could speak to communicate with each other to do business. And again, the reason why you wouldn't want it to be English is because then the English speakers who are not your friends can interrupt and interfere with your business much more easily than if you were speaking in an African language. So that's the thing that we have to really do. Like, it's good that we could speak the English, but it's bad that we can't speak not one African language. And so when we want to do business, when we want to conduct trade, policy, political, social, etc., we can't do it. This is why I always say you need a strong Africa to have a strong African. When Africa itself starts to push the value of their language, or languages, I should say, now we will be cooking with gas. Prestige planning, therefore, entails associating African languages with an economic value on the labor market and requiring academic skills in these languages as one of the criteria for access to employment. So this is what I've been talking about with this curriculum stuff. The curriculum allows our future generations, if not ourselves, to be able to go to any country in the continent and be able to help them solve problems, right? Reciprocity. But also, part of the curriculum has to have a language structure component, right? Wherein, like that person who told me they wanted their future children to learn Chinese and stuff like that, it has to have that language that you're learning with this curriculum has to be tied with some type of economic value for your labor. So if you're going to go back to solve problems, right? That's labor. If you're going to go back to give labor to solve problems in Africa, right? It'll be advantageous for you to know a language when you're going back. It'll help you conduct business better. It'll help you fall in and be a part of the community much better. So there's different sides of the work that needs to be done here. We're doing work outside, but the continent has a lot of work to do on the inside as well. For example, in order to get a job in any public establishment in South Africa, candidates would have to show proficiency both in a language spoken by the white and colored population, English or Afrikaans, and a language spoken by the black majority population, i.e. Sotho or Nguni language. But how can African languages be assigned a market value to make them instrumentally competitive with English, at least in the local labor market? All right, so let's see what their answer is to that question. Though the prestige planning Kamawanga Malu promises great advantages for the majority population of Africa and for the survival and development of African languages, it should also be mentioned that there is nothing wrong with learning English or other ex-colonial language to a high level of proficiency. The problem arises when a foreign language like English becomes the medium of instruction. Okay, for a second I was clutching my pearls, and then this author clarifies himself. Many Africans, including both parents and politicians, are not aware of the great difference between learning a foreign language as a subject and using that language as a language of instruction. There is a difference. In the latter case, the language actually becomes a barrier to learning subject matter and to the development of learners' skills in both their own language and the foreign language itself. The student subjected to this type of teaching therefore loses on three fronts. What would Ubuntu assessment thinking mean? The learners in Makalela's example, who were taught via a translanguaging model by a teacher conversant in several South African languages, were also lucky enough to be assessed via a translanguaging model. This echoes Julius Nyere's thinking in Education for Self-Reliance, in which he imagines how assessments and exams might be restructured according to Ubuntu principles. If you want me to read that paper, I have to try to find it. If you want me to read that book, let me know. Discussing the educational goals of newly independent Tanzania, Nyerere, in 1968, page 63 writes, "The purpose is not to provide an inferior education to that given at present. The purpose is to provide a different education. Nyerere wants Tanzania's education system to emphasize cooperative endeavor rather than individual advancement and to stress the concepts of equality and responsibility. This resonates with Ubuntu philosophy, in which care for others and cooperation are valued more highly than competition and individual advancement." Nyerere was aware that examinations are decisive for the curriculum, not least because many teachers teach largely or even solely with them in mind. On the subject of examinations and testing, Nyerere had this to say: "The examinations our children at present sit are themselves geared to an international standard and practice which has developed regardless of our particular problems and needs." Isn't that what I've been talking about? You're learning an education, right? You're getting this education, right, that's based on an international standard. That is, if you're in the continent, that's what the case was when I was growing up, especially in the Caribbean, and that's even the case here. You're getting an education based on a foreign standard. Again, to use Onitase's term, you're a population within a nation. You're getting a foreign education. And this education is developed giving zero fucks about your particular problems and your needs as a people. This is the problem. Sorry, this was a quote. The examinations our children at present sit are themselves geared to an international standard of practice which has developed regardless of our particular problems and needs. What we need to do now is to think first about the education we want to provide, and when thinking is completed, think about whether some form of examination is an appropriate way of closing an education phase. Then such an examination should be designed to fit the education which has been provided. At one time in the Caribbean, there was an exam after grade 6, after primary school, that determined what type of secondary school you were going to go to. And this is some shit the British said, right? And a lot of folks had their education stunted, right? Because again, like for example, even myself, I remember doing a GCE exam, right? Again, a GCE exam is some British shit again. And the prompts for the exam didn't reflect, the country in which I'm from. Didn't reflect how we lived as students, what we did, nothing. And so the prompt was almost difficult to comprehend. Right? It was like a writing prompt. And a lot of people had problems with it. And this is the reason. The reason is because you're doing these exams that don't give a shit about you as a people, what you need, what you want, what you desire, what's necessary, right? And so it definitely, creates this chasm between you and learning. And then we wonder, where did this school to prison pipeline come from? And it's these exams that really kill you. These foreign exams that don't tie into anything concerning you, but your whole future is based on these exams. As a statesman and teacher, he was called Mwalamu, which means teacher, and was proud of that name. Julius Nyerere knew that international, read Western, examinations were irrelevant and even detrimental to the type of holistic education he envisaged for Tanzania. Both the content of national exams built on Western models and the language in which questions must be answered are therefore foreign to the majority of children in Africa. The annual examination reports produced by the Kenyan National Examination Council consistently report the failure of candidates to perform optimally in math and science, either because they fail to understand the questions or because they cannot express themselves clearly in English. In the view of Kembo Sure and Nathan Ogichi, 2009, this amounts to a denial of quality education to the majority of Kenyan children. If Tanzanian students beyond Form 4 is the equivalent of grade 10 in America. If Tanzanian students beyond Form 4 answer exam questions in Kiswahili instead of English, the examiners at the National Examination Council of Tanzania are instructed to award them 0 points even when the answer is correct, even when the answer is completely correct. Whose fault is it for giving a student a 0 for answering a question in their mother tongue correctly? Whose fault is that? On the 7th of August, 2015, the former president of Tanzania, Ali Hassan Mwinyi, called for Kiswahili to be adopted as a language of instruction in secondary schools, especially for the teaching of science subjects. Quote, education plays an important role in economic development, and there is a need to to prioritize Kiswahili in the teaching of science practicals. This will in turn help the science sector to grow and contribute toward the country's technological and economic growth. Go back in the past, I did episodes on STEM and the need for our people to embrace STEM more. And you see how that's tied into this quote here of the project that we're about education, right? Education and science generally feeds into commerce, feeds into economics, right? You need those things for economic growth. The former president was speaking during a Young Scientific Tanzania press conference attended by 240 students from all over the country. President Mwini declared that students would be better able to understand and explain scientific concepts if taught in their own language. Some years ago, the World Bank stipulated that developing countries had to introduce TIMS which is Trends in International Mathematical and Science Study, tests in order to be eligible for support for the education sector. The World Bank finances the participation of several developing countries in the TIMS test. Ghana came out as number 44 of the 45 nations that participated. South Africa was number 45. Ghanaian students scored 276 on the TIMS test against an international average of 466. In two articles in Ghana News, Eric Frido Kwarteng and Francis Ahia, 2005, tried to explain these low results. In the first article, they discussed the results in mathematics. In the second, the results in science. Since Ghanaian students took the test in English, the so-called official language of Ghana, those whose first language is not English are at a great disadvantage. We are not surprised that countries that top performed in the mathematics tests, Taiwan, Malaysia, Latvia, Russia, use their own language to teach and learn mathematics. I chuckle because, I don't like to promote, any kind of victim mentality, but, we are definitely victims of the West. And look at it right here. So these other countries, Taiwan, Malaysia, Russia, Latvia, they were able to do the same tests in their home language. But because of the friggin' World Bank involvement in these African countries, that forced you to have to even participate in this type of testing. And on top of that, forced you to have to do it in English. Here you are, 45th and 46th, 44th and 45th in the 45 nations that participate. And the sad reality is you continue to do it. And again, I guess you're quote unquote being forced to do it by these world banks. Y'all better get accustomed to the idea that to change this predicament, you gotta fight your way out of this. You ain't gonna talk and reason no one into seeing it your way. You have to say, screw y'all, screw what you're trying to do. And if you have a problem with it, we're gonna fight about it. And you know what I mean when I say fight about it. The two authors, both of whom are mathematics educators, argue that a Ghanaian student who's proficient in his or her native language would be likely to answer most of the questions correctly if they were translated into that language. The authors further criticized the test for being rooted in a Western, especially American environment, featuring concepts which are unfamiliar in Ghana, such as parking lot. Damn. From that professional experience as Ghanaian educators, they knew that students are more likely to be able to solve mathematical problems if they can relate to their cultural context. Steven Schoberg, 2006, is afraid that despite these misgivings, the TIMS curriculum, which will be installed as a norm or ideal the world over. More than 20 years ago, the British researcher Angela Little expressed the same concern. Before I read this concern from Angela Little, you know, as wild as it may sound that Ghanaian students aren't familiar with parking lots, right? You know, in the Caribbean, you know, we're not really familiar with parallel parking. If you're in the US, you know what I'm talking about. There's really no parallel parking where we come from. You park head first into a parking spot, right? So I can get what, imagine, you know, for those of you who are Caribbean, imagine taking a test in the Caribbean, not having been to the US or anything, and on the test they're talking about parallel parking. You would have to wonder what the hell is going on here. What are they talking about? You know, so I get that. I get that idea. Like, you know, folks in Ghana don't know what a parking lot is. So when you put down the test, you have me lost in that whole question. Shout out to Daily Affirmations by Pauline in the chat room. I don't know what was said. Pro Black Perspective says, "Damn, yeah, this is something worthy to say damn about." So more than 20 years ago, the British researcher Angela Little expressed the same concern. Quote, "Will he who lends or gives financial resources insist also on lending the educational ideas and practices? Will cultural conditionality, which is already implicit in much lending for education, become more explicit in the next decade in the same way as economic and political conditionality have become explicit in the 80s and early 90s? If so, to what extent will this prejudice the development of the local cultures which learners bring to the classroom?" You know, and yeah, I talked about that like in the 80s as a kid. I remember my uncles and them, you know, schooling me on this IMF game, this World Bank game, and feeling like the sorrow for that, but not realizing at the time, of course. Well, I guess to a certain extent they did mention it, but not realizing how deep it went in terms of the education, and definitely not realizing, being that I was a young guy, a kid, not realizing that, damn, like when they intrude on this education, they're gonna mess up the minds of the people who are being educated. Daily Affirmations by Pauline. Make sure to follow her on YouTube as well. Your platform is so relevant in education and how we, from the African diaspora, can keep our native tongue alive and be proud of who we are. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But the thing is, as it's clear here, it should have been clear even outside of this reading, like, we have to do it. These folks talking about they're giving aid and handing out loans and all this old shit for your development are actually doing the reverse to you when they take away your tongue. When they tell you you can't learn in your native tongue, you can't create your exams, right? So the references in your exams don't even reference how you live. They're destroying you. You have to take control of your education. Many developing countries, especially those with a colonial past, have worked hard to liberate themselves from the curricula, books, tests, and ideals of their former colonial masters. And that's the thing too, like, the best thing we can do as people today, in and out of the continent, is to create material, you know, besides curriculum, but also create textbooks, create, you know, fiction and nonfiction, create materials that's African-centered, right? That is our people expressing ourselves in these books. You know, there's a brother I've mentioned on the show before, Exports the Mark on Twitter. Make sure to follow him too. Shout out to that brother. I mean, he drops some historical stuff sometimes that is just like, wow. Eye-opening, all that. And, you know, I mentioned today, like, him, and Onitase should really work on creating a documentary that counters. And it doesn't even have to be, you know, it could be like a, you know, a quote-unquote radio documentary or a slide-based documentary or something. But something where, you know, we really put out like real truth, real information, nothing that's, you know, what's the word? You know, not like the hidden color stuff that, you know, puts extras on it. Sometimes tells half true, sometimes deals in pseudo intellectualism. In fact, often deals in pseudo intellectualism, but, you know, really tackle some history and stuff like that in a documentary. Like, that's something that we really should do. So I'm putting that out there. I know Onitase saw it, but after we were done doing some of the work that we're doing now, you know, he doing his stuff, me doing my stuff, we should really think about something like that. Many developing countries, especially those with colonial past, have worked hard to liberate themselves from the curricula, books, tests, and ideals of their former colonial masters. Since independence, educational research in Africa have been constantly debating what quality in education may mean in their own context and how it should be assessed. By the way, as I mentioned that, the books, etc., make sure you guys pick up a copy of the Book of Power, the Pro-Black Compendium from Onitase. Now, not only TIMS, but the tests run by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are also making their way into Africa through a program named Program for International Student Assessment for Development. PISA, as it's called, actually extends the OECD's influence on the global governance of education. The ambition behind PISA raises important questions. Angeline Barrett, 2014, asked, how feasible and desirable is it to measure learning across the world along one set of scales? What implications does a single internationally recognized measure have for school curriculum? How will spillover generate capacity to measure and improve education quality at the national level? Barrett notes that PISA creates a pressure for curricular convergence and comes to define the knowledge and skills that are valued around the world. The work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos and colleagues helps to inform scrutiny of the Western epistemology underlying tests like TIMSS and PISA. In their book, Another Knowledge is Possible, Beyond Northern Epistemologies, de Sousa Santos in 2007 and colleagues highlight the influence of Western Europe's former imperialism and the current logic of neoliberalism on scientific knowledge. They also note that these influences are inscribed to various degrees in school curricula around the world. In a similar vein, Barrett, 2014, notes that the PISA for development may act as a disincentive for curricular innovation at the local level. It is also probable that only the subjects most likely to figure in the PISA test will be given prominence and granted adequate teaching time, meaning that subjects like history, the arts, and physical education are accorded less time and value. As all educators know, the testing regime determines the curriculum that is taught. Julius Nyerere understood this and insisted that education in Africa should be built on African values, ideals, and needs. Whether and how learning should be assessed should also be decided by Africans themselves in a way that fits the education given. In order for Africa to build upon an education system that adheres to the values of Ubuntu, it is therefore critical both to teach in the languages learners speak and understand, and to avoid the Western testing regime. There's so much that the Western world could learn from Africa, but that can only happen when Africa looks to herself, her own history, traditions, languages, and culture, and does not let herself be subjugated to a global governance of education. Now, that last part is clearly easier said than done, because Africa is operating still on diplomacy and by living by its word. So we signed for these loans, and this was the deal, this was the terms of the loan, and we shall live it out. But Africa needs to realize, nah. We're not doing that no more. It's when Africa stands up as a strong nation, right? And it's I know there's 50 plus countries in Africa, but when they stand up together as one unified nation, then the whole world will change. We need to do our part outside. They need to do their part inside. Africa has to give up on this kind of diplomatic relations with these folks who are clearly putting in the work to keep you down. But again, this is where wherever there's a problem, there's a need for solutionaries. We can be those solutionaries. We can do the work outside of the continent that can even inspire the continent to do and be better. When you have our folks from outside of the continent returning to the continent, skills in hand, language on the tongue, ready to put in work, that can't be denied. That cannot be denied. Now, I'm not saying that we're going into Africa and bully our way through just because we know the language and we have these skills. We still got to work with and commune with the people. This is why the concept of Ubuntu is my favorite concept. Once we instill this idea of community and humanness in our people, home and abroad, right? The work will be easier to do. But right now, family, what's going on here? And this is a 2016 paper, 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago now. This really shouldn't be going on in the continent. Aside from Afrohili and Kiswahili and Hausa, what other languages do you think we should try to get some instruction in going forward? You know, my idea for the Kiswahili episodes, I think, are a good one. Maybe someone else will do Hausa. But again, you got to find the people who can speak English at least a little bit to communicate with us, right? For us to work together and make this thing happen. And like I said, it could be something conversational. I can also supply the PDF textbooks for Kiswahili, and I do believe I have Hausa as well. So if you like what this episode entailed, hopefully this was a good episode to you guys. I found it to be a good reading. I found it to support other readings that we've done recently and similar concepts, right? But this paradigm of Ubuntu, we got to really start to look into this a little closer. We got to start not only to look into it, but we got to start living it now too. On the next episode of the podcast, which should be Tuesday, like I said, I'm working on a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday schedule for the time being while I'm home. And on the next episode, I think I'm going to switch it up a little bit and not talk directly about curriculum, but I'm going to talk about the military in traditional African societies. Remember, a few episodes ago, I read a quote that said that education is only second to war, right? Should only be second to war. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about war in the next episode. Talk a little bit about how we conducted our business out here when you talk about military. So I hope you guys tune in next time to the episodes. Thanks for you guys who kept me company in the chat room. Thanks for all the thumbs up. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. If you want to help with the structuring and the creation of this African-centered curriculum that we've been talking about for a while now, make sure ask me how to join the Discord. It's free to join Discord. Ask me how to join our server on the Discord, and let's start doing this work. You know, I have several resources up there. We just need hands to put something together. So next episode, look out for me talking about the military and traditional African societies. Of course, it'll probably tie back into, you know, curriculum and education, but we'll see how that goes when we get there. Again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.